But first things first, Senator Tom Cotton, welcome back.
Hey there, Brian. It's good to be back on with you.
Well, I mean, so much to talk about. Let's begin with the decision by the administration to use cluster bombs. You for it?
Absolutely, Brian. In fact, I've been calling for this for months and months. This is yet another example of Biden's indecision and how it set Ukraine back. The president has been pussyfooting around now for almost a year and a half, refusing to provide Ukraine certain weapons that they need to defend their own territory, only to reverse himself months later when they're in a situation where they have to retake their territory. We have millions and millions of these artillery shells sitting on our shelves. We're almost certainly never going to use them ourselves. They are suitable for the exact kind of artillery systems we've already provided to Ukraine. There is an international treaty that many countries have signed against using them, but we have not signed it, and Russia has not signed it, and China has not signed it. And if I could just put a very fine point on it, Russia is using cluster munitions in Ukraine, and Ukraine has pleaded with us for months to let Ukraine use cluster munitions in Ukraine. So why the hell would we care if Ukraine uses cluster munitions in Ukraine? If it helps them retake their territory and end this war, we should have done it months ago.
But tactically, don't they help with minefields? Don't they blow up these minefields ahead of the time, allow you to get through there?
From a military standpoint, they are highly effective, not only against minefields, potentially clearing a path, but also against troops in the open or troops dug in, or even vehicles as well. And again, we have millions of these shells sitting on our shelves, and almost certainly are not going to use them. So we should have been providing them to Ukraine months ago, when Ukraine could have used them in its current offensive.
So right now we understand there's been 9,000 civilian dead at minimum. 11 million Ukrainians have been forced from their home. That's a quarter of their population have just been moved out. They still don't have the promised F-16s, and it doesn't look like the training is starting until the fall. To me, this is mind-boggling. You know, politically, we have an election coming up. It's to the Ukrainians' benefit to get this counteroffensive on the march. You have a window of opportunity with the chaos and the Wagner Group and the March on Moscow, there's no rush to do it. And, you know, Ukraine can't be too demanding because they know they can't overstep their bounds because we are their chief supplier. But listen to how they explain their decision on cluster bombs. Here is Admiral Kirby on ABC.
They are using artillery at a very accelerated rate, Martha, many thousands of rounds per day. This is literally a gunfight in all along, from the Donbass all the way down towards Zaporizhia and Kherson. And so they're running out of inventory. We are trying to ramp up our production of the kind of artillery shells that they're using most. But that production rate is still not where we want it to be. So we're going to send these additional artillery shells that have cluster bomblets in them to help bridge the gap as we ramp up production of normal 155 artillery shells.
And she said, so you're using these because you don't have others? And he said, yes, they are. So he's admitting, instead of this being a tactical choice, it's at a necessity. We don't have enough to give them. Is that possible, Senator?
Yeah, Brian, unfortunately, that's the case. And I mean, it's been increasingly the case in various kinds of munitions, not just in the United States, but our European partners as well, given the woeful state of our defense industrial base. That's why I've been calling for months now for a much more aggressive effort by the Biden administration to ramp up production of these basic munitions. We're not talking about large and complicated weapon systems. We're talking about something as simple as a 155-millimeter artillery shell. These things should not take months, much less years to make. But there are certain steps that need to take that we haven't taken yet, like providing multi-year contracts so companies have the certainty they need to increase production rates or even add an entire new line of production, allowing other countries to buy these weapons on an accelerated basis to, again, create the demand that the companies need to invest in their factories that build these weapons. But it's very worrisome for what happened in Ukraine. It's also very worrisome Brian, for the prospects of deterring war over Taiwan in the Western Pacific. It's a serious problem. The administration needs to move much faster on it. I understand that they're excited that they've taken steps to get production down from several years to just 18 months on some weapon systems, but we can't locate our shoulder patting ourselves on the back on that. We have to get that 18-month timeline on these weapon systems down to 2, 3, 4 months.
So the President of the United States announced that the Ukrainians are not ready to join NATO, but he also is optimistic about Sweden. Listen to what he was saying about Sweden, and now I'll give you reality after it. Cut 19.
There is Turkey is looking for modernization of F-16 aircraft, and Mitsotakis in Greece is also looking for some help. And so what I'm trying to, quite frankly, put together is a little bit of a consortium here where we're strengthening NATO in terms of the military capacity of both Greece as well as Turkey, and allow Sweden to come in. But it's in play. It's not done.
But you're hopeful.
I'm hopeful. Matter of fact, I'm optimistic.
But now you shouldn't be, because Turkey, who I have no idea, I know they're strategically an advantage to have in NATO, but they're anti-West. They said, unless you're going to give us a path to the European Union admission, we're not going to approve Sweden. We all know that Sweden would help the NATO alliance. What would you do, Senator?
Well, Sweden and Finland both sought NATO membership last year because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and they both do add significantly to the military and the geographical advantages that NATO has. I think this is a failure of the Biden administration, and really Joe Biden personally, that he's let this languish for so long. Obviously, there are tensions between Turkey and Sweden. Hungary objects as well, but no one thinks Hungary would continue to object if President Erdogan in Turkey acceded to Sweden's joining NATO, and everyone had hoped that that would happen by the summit that the president is traveling to right now. And the president should have invested a lot more personally in ensuring that Erdogan worked on his differences with Sweden, so Sweden could have been welcomed already. But it really should happen sooner rather than later. The president mentioned conditioning the grant of F-16s to Turkey, approving Sweden. I think that's something that should be done at a minimum.
So the Ukrainian counteroffensive, we don't know quite what's happening. The Wall Street Journal is reporting that the Ukrainian forces are attempting to soften Russian defenses before liberating the territory. They don't have any air cover, but that explains the slower pace. They have not fully gone in. You understand that as a guy who fought in the military, in the infantry, you know what they're up against and how this, it looks like the Russians lost minimum 50,000 men, 200,000 casualties. The Ukrainians haven't given their numbers, but most likely very high. What do you think tactically is going on there? Well,
defeating a dug-in, entrenched enemy is one of the hardest operations in ground combat, and defending when you're dug in and entrenched is one of the easier operations for other aircraft. So the Russians are very well defended in those trenches with minefields and anti-tank devices. I think Ukraine right now is fighting against those defenses. I don't think they've committed their full main effort yet, though, in part because they want to soften up the Russian defenses. And the Russian defenses hold until they don't. That's one lesson we saw last September in Kharkiv in the northeast and in Kherson in the south, is that it's hard to predict when Russian lines may break. And hopefully they'll break soon, because the quickest way to end this war is for Ukraine to begin to have more battlefield victories, and for Vladimir Putin to know that he's got more to lose on the battlefield than he does at the negotiating table.
You know how we left Afghanistan, the biggest disaster in modern American history, and how those people who fought there are having especially hard time dealing with it, especially if they lost a loved one, limb, or psychological or emotional balance, because they say, what was it all for? Well, it gets worse. Lieutenant Colonel Scott Mann, who put together Operation Pineapple, said this about what's happening in Afghanistan now. Cut 34.
Over-the-horizon strikes are not a standalone strategy. They do not do that. They are a disruptive approach, but they do not degrade the networks like Al-Qaeda and ISIS the way that we want to. And what I'm most concerned about, while this strike was useful in Syria, Afghanistan is reemerging as a terror safe haven right now. We're getting reporting that Abdullah bin Laden is operating with impunity in Kandahar. Camp Bastion, a former Marine base, is now a receiving area for Chechens, North African, and sub-Indian continent foreign fighters. So you tell me if over the horizon is working.
And he's talking about the killing, of which we always support, of an ISIS leader, but telling us the reality that left behind in Afghanistan, which the president recently said there is no al-Qaeda presence there. What do you hear, Senator Tom Cotton?
Yeah, well, I think Colonel Mann is actually being a little too generous to the administration. Over-the-horizon strikes are certainly not a standalone strategy, but it's really not even a viable strategy by itself. As I said at the time, if you have zero American presence, I don't just mean troops, I mean zero diplomatic presence, zero intelligence presence in a country that's landlocked like Afghanistan is and has forbidding geography, it's almost impossible to develop the intelligence that's necessary to conduct any kind of airstrikes against terrorist targets. I'm only aware of one, and that's been publicly acknowledged. That was the killing of Ayman al-Zawahiri, and now almost 2 years since Kabul collapsed and the Taliban took over. I can't get into the details, obviously, but I can just say that I do not view what happened with Ayman al-Zawahiri as something that can be replicated. That was a unique set of conditions, and I'm glad that we killed the emir of al-Qaeda back then, but it's also not something that I think that our intelligence community or our military can replicate. So I think Colonel Mann, if anything, is being too generous to the Biden administration. Over-the-horizon strikes on their own are not even working, much less integrated and part of a broader strategy, and that's why you are seeing large parts of Afghanistan return into terrorist influence, if not terrorist controlled.
What was accomplished in Janet Yellen's visit? What do you think is going to be happening with John Kerry, the climate czar's visit to China?
Yeah, I mean, what I think was accomplished by Janet Yellen going to China and kowtowing to them was to embolden Chinese communists, not just militarily, but to think that if Janet Yellen is setting economic policy for the United States, they continue to cheat and lie and take advantage of American workers and American companies. I shudder to think what John Kerry will do when he goes there, probably give away the farm. I mean, he'll say, you can take every one of our jobs and our factories, and you can take Taiwan as well, as long as you promise in some very fleeting and unenforceable way to reduce carbon emissions by 2075 or some such nonsense.
The problem is, I think right now, is that we have a trade deficit of, we have $690 billion worth of trade with China, despite terrible relations. There's a mutual need on both sides, but we stop letting them use our cloud, and they're going to stop with two precious metals or rare earth metals that we need for these batteries and this a lot of this technology that have been jammed down our throats. What's going to give here?
Yeah, I've called now for some time to undertake what I call a strategic decoupling. We cannot allow China to have us over a barrel on critical products or services. It's bad, and we shouldn't have let China take over, say, our furniture industry or our textile industry. That's not something that threatens our health or safety or prosperity, though. But for China to have the market cornered on certain kinds of semiconductor chips or certain kind of minerals that are critical for all modern electronics is totally unacceptable, to say nothing of having the market cornered on things like penicillin or heparin or acetaminophen. It's very important that we start to build that manufacturing capacity back here in the United States and help our allies and partners build it as well.
Senator, what's been the biggest surprise looking at the GOP race this July up to this point with all these candidates now in? What's been the biggest surprise for you?
You know, Brian, to be honest with you, I haven't been following the race all that closely. I know a lot of these candidates, and I've worked with them from Donald Trump to Ron DeSantis, Tim Scott, and others, and I wish them all well. I think it's still early. I guess I'm a little surprised by just the size of the field. I thought it might have been a little bit smaller, but I think that goes to show that a lot of people think they have something to contribute to our party, and I know that they do, whether they end up as our nominee or they return to one of their other offices or seek another office. So, like I said, I know them all well, and I wish them well. And like you and like all voters in Arkansas, I'm going to be watching the race closely as it heats up in months ahead.
My biggest surprise is that Donald Trump's up by 30 points. Would you have predicted that?
You know, Brian, having elected not to be a candidate myself, I elect not to be a strategist or a pundit for the candidates. I'll let them manage that, and I'll leave the punditry to you.
All right, so you're not going to endorse either?
I don't plan to at this point. Like I said, I know a lot of these candidates. I consider them personal friends. I did not endorse in 2016 until President Trump secured the nomination. I think the best thing I can do is try to help develop the ideas and the platform that will help whoever our nominee is, not just win the White House, but win back the Senate, hold the House, and then have an agenda to deliver to the American people successfully in 2025.
And maybe be a Secretary of State or Secretary of Defense. I'll see if I can get you that job. That's what I'm thinking. All right, Senator Tom Cotton, thanks so much.
Thank you, Brian.